My dad remarried when I was 11, and the first thing my stepmother said to me was that she loved my hair. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say to a child whose mother had just moved out 6 months ago. But I smiled and said thank you. Because that's what you do when you're 11, and your dad is looking at you with that hopeful, fragile expression that means, please just try. I'm 31 now. I work as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in Waterloo, Ontario. I find financial fraud for a living. I reconstruct paper trails. I look at numbers and find the lies hiding inside them. My stepmother knew this. She knew it for years. She still thought she could get away with it. My dad's parents, my grandparents, owned a property in Prince Edward County, not a mansion, not some sprawling estate, just a solid century home on about 4 acres, with an old barn that leaned a little to the left and a view of the water that made you forget, briefly, that anything in the world was wrong. My grandmother had grown up in that house. My grandfather had proposed to her on the back porch. They raised my dad and his brother there. When my grandfather passed, my grandmother stayed, and when she started having trouble with her hip, she started talking about what would happen to it when she was gone. She was methodical about it. That was always her way. She updated her will, set up a trust, had her lawyer, a quiet man in Picton named Mr. Oshabe, walk her through every detail. The trust specified that the property would pass to her 2 sons equally, with a right of survivorship. My dad's share would then flow to me, his only child. My uncle had 2 kids of his own, and his share would go to them. It was clean, it was documented, it was exactly the kind of thing that should have been simple. My stepmother had been married to my dad for 19 years by the time my grandmother passed. 19 years is long enough to learn how a household works, where the documents are kept, and which conversations happen when you're not in the room. I flew home to Waterloo from a conference in Vancouver the week my grandmother died. My dad called me at 6 in the morning and I was on the first flight I could get. He was devastated in that quiet way some men are. The kind where they keep doing small useful things, making tea, feeding the dog, checking the weather, because stopping means feeling it. My stepmother was there, of course, organized and efficient, making calls, handling arrangements, steering everything. I told myself she was helping. I wanted to believe she was helping. The funeral was in September. The drive up to the county was beautiful in that painful autumn way, the maples already bleeding orange and red along the highway. My uncle was there with his wife and their kids. We stood around my grandmother's grave on a clear, cold morning, and I thought about how she used to let me sit in her kitchen and eat shortbread while she did the crossword. I thought about how she always called me her sharp one. I thought about the property and what it meant, and how much she had loved it. 3 weeks after the funeral, my stepmother mentioned the property at dinner. She didn't bring it up dramatically. That was never her style. She brought it up the way you mentioned that you're thinking of repainting the fence. Casually, conversationally, while passing the salad, she said something about how it would be a lot to manage, a property like that, all the way out in the county. She said maybe it made more sense to liquidate it and split the proceeds now, before winter, before maintenance became a problem. My dad nodded slowly. He was still raw. He would have agreed to almost anything that month. I said I'd have to look at the trust documents first. My stepmother looked at me the way she had been looking at me since I was 11 years old, which was the way you look at something mildly inconvenient that you nonetheless have to tolerate. She smiled and said, of course. The trust documents were supposed to be in the filing cabinet in my dad's home office. I knew the cabinet. It was an old gray 4-drawer that had been in that office since before my parents divorced. My dad said he'd get them to me. A week passed, then 2. He kept saying he was looking. They must have gotten moved during the renovation. He'd find them. I called Mr. Ashebe's office directly. His assistant was polite and unhelpful. She said they couldn't share trust documents with me without authorization from the named trustee. I asked who the named trustee was. She paused and said she wasn't able to share that either. I called my uncle. He'd been trying to get information too. He'd been hitting the same walls. He'd received a letter, he told me, through the mail, on the letterhead of a law firm in Toronto I'd never heard of, informing him that the property had already been transferred, that the transfer had occurred prior to my grandmother's death as part of an inter vivos arrangement, and that as a result the original trust no longer governed the asset. He read me the letter over the phone. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my office building in Waterloo and listened to him read me this letter, and I felt something go very still inside me. An inter vivos transfer, a gift made while living, signed by my grandmother apparently some 14 months before she died. My uncle said, Do you believe that? I said, no. Here's what I do at work. I take financial documents, tax returns, corporate filings, bank records, real estate transfers, and I look at them for what they are rather than what they claim to be. I look at signatures and compare them to known exemplars. I look at dates and cross-reference them against other dates. I look at metadata, I look at the fonts and PDFs and whether the ink distribution on a printed page is consistent with a document that was actually filled in by hand. I do this for corporations and insurance companies and occasionally for the RCMP. I called my dad and asked him if he knew about the inter-vivos transfer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said my stepmother had mentioned it, yes. He said she'd handled it. He said my grandmother had wanted to avoid probate complications and that my stepmother had helped coordinate it. I asked him when this had happened. He said he wasn't sure exactly. He thought maybe 2 years ago. He thought my grandmother had understood what she was signing. I asked him if he had copies of any of the documents. He said my stepmother had them. I asked him if I could speak with my stepmother. He said she wasn't home. I drove to Picton on a Saturday in November by myself and sat down with Mr. Oshabe. He was in his late 60s, white-haired, with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on. He had known my grandmother for 30 years. When I told him what I'd found out, he went very still behind his desk. He said my grandmother had come to see him approximately 16 months before she died. She had been in the early stages of cognitive decline. Not severe, but notable. She had been confused about some of the details of her trust on that visit. She had not mentioned any intention to make an inter vivos transfer of the property. He had no record of facilitating one. He had no record of any other solicitor contacting him about one. I asked him whether he knew the Toronto firm named in my uncle's letter. He looked it up while I sat there. Then he looked at me over his glasses. The firm had been dissolved 8 months ago. It had been incorporated just over 2 years ago. It had one listed director, a numbered company, which traced back through 2 more layers to a holding company registered in Alberta. He said, I think you need to speak with an estates litigation lawyer. I already had an appointment booked for Monday morning. What I'm going to tell you next is the part that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. Not because it surprised me, it didn't, not exactly, but because of what it required my father to understand about the woman he'd been married to for 19 years. The transfer documents had been faxed in the current year, to a law office in Toronto that no longer existed, from a machine registered to a business address that turned out to be a mailbox rental in Mississauga. The signature on the transfer, the one attributed to my grandmother, had been notarized by a commissioner of oaths whose name appeared on the document, but who, when tracked down, had no memory of witnessing it, and whose own signature appeared to have been lifted from a different document entirely. My grandmother had been 83 years old and had early-stage dementia when this transfer had supposedly occurred. Her GP's records showed she had a scheduled appointment on the exact day the documents were supposedly signed in a Toronto office. She had not been in Toronto. She had been in Belleville, at her doctor's office, 40 minutes in the opposite direction. I had a copy of that appointment record. I had obtained it to her estate, through proper channels with the cooperation of my uncle and her GP. I also had something else. The transfer documents had been produced as PDFs. Standard practice now. Everything is electronic. I do not know if my stepmother understood what PDFs contain, beyond what is visible on the screen. She may not have known, many people don't, that a PDF retains metadata. Creation date, modification date, the software used to generate it, and in some cases, depending on the software, the user account name of the person who created it. The metadata on the transfer documents showed a creation date of 11 months ago. The documents that were supposedly signed 14 months ago had been created, digitally, 11 months ago. The software listed was a version of Adobe Acrobat. The licensed user name attached to that version was my stepmother's full legal name. I printed that metadata report and I put it in a folder, and then I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Picton, and I called my dad. He answered on the second ring. I could hear the television in the background, some kind of home renovation show she always had on. I asked him if she was nearby. He said she was in the kitchen. I asked him to go somewhere private. I heard him walk. A door closed. He said, "What's going on?" I said, "Dad, I need to tell you some things, and I need you to listen to me before you say anything." I talked for about 20 minutes. I told him about the dissolved law firm, the forged notarization, the GP appointment record, the metadata, I read him the licensed username from the metadata report. I read it to him twice because he asked me to. When I finished, there was a long silence. He said, "She told me your grandmother wanted this." I said, "I know." He said, "She told me it was simpler, that it avoided all the probate complications." I said, "I know." He said my name, just my name, nothing else. And his voice broke on it. I want to be honest about how hard that moment was. Because my stepmother had never been cruel to me, not openly. She had never screamed at me or locked me out or done anything that would look bad from the outside. What she had done was quieter than that. She had made me feel, for 20 years, like a guest in my own father's house, like someone to be tolerated. She had never once said directly that I wasn't family, but she had arranged everything so that I understood it. The Christmas budgets, the space in the family photos, the way she referred to me in the third person even when I was sitting right there. And she had looked at my father's grief and my grandmother's dementia and decided that this was her opportunity. My dad moved out of the house 2 weeks later. He stayed with my uncle while everything got sorted out. My stepmother hired a lawyer, a real one this time, and denied everything. The litigation took 7 months. At one point, her lawyer tried to argue that the metadata could have been corrupted or manipulated, which was a creative position that did not survive contact with the forensic IT expert our side brought in. The transfer was ruled fraudulent and voided by the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. The property went back into my grandmother's estate and was distributed according to her original trust, the way she had intended, the way Mr. Ashive had helped her set up. My stepmother was also referred to the Crown for criminal fraud. That process is still ongoing, as these things take time in this country. I don't have a verdict to give you. What I have is the court ruling and my uncle's handshake in the parking lot of the courthouse in Picton on a gray March afternoon, and my dad sitting across from me at a diner in Belleville the following week, ordering the same thing he always orders, a grilled cheese and a black coffee, and saying quietly that he was sorry it had taken him so long to see it. I told him I understood. I meant it. The property is still there. The barn still leans a little to the left. Last summer, my uncle's kid spent a week out there and texted me photos of the water at sunset, orange and pink, the way it looks in August. My dad is thinking about going up for Thanksgiving this year. My grandmother called me her sharp one. She was right. I still think about the drive back from Picton the day I called my dad from that Tim Hortons parking lot. It was November, already dark by 4:30, and I sat there with the engine running and the heat on and the metadata report sitting on the passenger seat in a manila folder. I'd looked at that file a dozen times by then. It never changed. It never said anything different. The numbers were just the numbers. People sometimes ask me if I feel angry. Honestly, by the time the court ruling came through, the anger had mostly burned off. What I felt instead was something quieter, a kind of clarity. Because here's the thing about fraud. It only works when people are not paying attention. My stepmother had counted on grief making my dad soft, on distance making my uncle slow, on my profession making me look like a threat rather than an asset. She had arranged the pieces carefully. She had been patient, and she had miscalculated on every single count. I think about what my grandmother built. Not just the property, but the intention behind it. She sat down with her lawyer. She thought carefully about each person she loved. She put it all in writing. That is a kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. It just holds. And I think about what it cost her at the end of her life to have that integrity exploited by someone who saw paperwork as an obstacle rather than a promise. What got me through those 7 months of litigation was not rage. It was the fact that I had done the work. I had learned something real, built something real. And when the moment came, I knew how to use it. My grandmother used to say that the sharp ones don't make the most noise. They just see more. I didn't understand that when I was a kid eating shortbread at her kitchen table. I understand it now. The skills I had spent years developing, the patience to read a document carefully, the discipline to follow a paper trail to the end, the willingness to say out loud what the numbers were actually showing, those things turned out to matter enormously. Not because I had planned for this moment, but because I had simply kept building them anyway. There is something I want to say to anyone watching this who has been made to feel like a footnote in their own family. The people who discount you are often counting on you to accept that assessment. They are counting on you to feel too small, too uncertain, too peripheral to push back. My stepmother looked at me for 20 years and saw someone manageable. She was wrong, and the reason she was wrong is not because I went looking for a fight. I didn't. It's because I had quietly, steadily become someone who knew what to do when the fight found me. That's the only version of this story I know how to tell. You build the person first. Then, when it matters, the person shows up. My grandmother called me her sharp one. I think she knew something I was still figuring out.